Welcome back. Today we're joined by a special guest.
Thank you, Mr. Kehl, for joining us today. Today we'll talk about a bit about organization and student learning.
Okay, I'm
Um,
ready.
okay, so to jump right in, what are the top five best skills for organization that can improve your learning?
Wow, a top five. I think it's really individual. Uh, like people do things differently to keep themselves organized. So I can talk about my top five if I can think of five. I like to have my digital world organized, and so that's number one because I don't, and I also don't like to have a desk, right? So that's my number two. When I have a desk, things pile up, and I just don't get things taken care of. My number three is I am a checklist person. I'm not like the master of like a bulleted journal or anything like that. I simply write things in that I need to do, cross them off when I'm done. Makes me feel I'm accomplished. Um, Number four, as far as organization, I actually need to personally connect in this case with my colleagues. I think it'd be different for students to kind of see what they're doing. And so, to be honest, sometimes I post their skills, or more often than not, it's like, oh, I need to do that. So I do check in with colleagues that are doing the same thing to just make sure I have things taken care of. Is that four or five? Where am
Four.
I at? Four. I got to think of a fifth one. A lot of you know Mrs. Kehl. She helps keep me organized. So number five is Mrs. Kehl. Um,
Oh,
That's very
I
nice.
do think a top five for students would be a little different, but yeah.
regarding students, what have you seen in your students that they do that really helps accomplish their schoolwork?
The students that I have seen that do really well with organization usually have a central place to organize. I guess why that's important. Like teachers often have different ways. Some teachers are using Google Classroom. Some teachers use ManageBack. Some teachers write it on the board if we were in person, right? And so students that do well generally take all of the things, whether it's CAS or personal project or extended essay or whatever, and they bring it to their personal space, whether that's an online checklist or a detailed bulleted journal or calendar or Google Calendar. That ability to take the complex and bring it into a central place for themselves, I think would be the number one ingredient for success for students.
Um, so you mentioned that you keep your digital work all organized. How would you recommend a student do that?
Well, I'm old, so I come from a time of like when we didn't always have these digital spaces. So I actually keep my digital space pretty much organized in the way that old people have file cabinets, for example, right? I have my English folder, I'd have my humanities folder, and all the things go in there. I have my junk folder of like, I don't want to delete this, but I'm going to put it in here for now. And so I organized my digital world um, in a old-fashioned traditional way of like shelves and file cabinets. And then it's also really important in the world of Google Suites is naming documents and naming them intentionally and specifically. So sometimes when I look at even my own every once in a while or other colleagues or other students, like I don't know how many things I have that are just like untitled. Like it is rare for me to have any document that is untitled in my Google Drive. And why that's important for Google Drive is your search is kind of like a hierarchy. The first thing that a search is going to pick up on is the title of documents. So if I were to make a recommendation for students, if you don't want to go old school, that's fine. You need to be intentional about how you label things. I'm sure both of you have experienced I'm like, what do we call that thing? And you're trying to search it up in Google Drive. And so if you yourself are specific, it will help you in your Google Suite. And so I guess personally how I do that is the classes that I teach, I have a tag, I guess, which you for every class, and every document that's associated with that class has that tag. So if I search that tag, I know I'm going to bring up my math class, for example, and it's specific to that class. That's one thing I do as well.
Yeah, that's extremely useful. I can see myself doing that as well, and like I think it also goes along with note taking, and I'm on the topic of note taking. What do you think is really important for students to remember?
I'm glad you asked for students. I am personally a horrible note taker, but so I do think it's important for students to recognize their strengths and weaknesses. And one of mine, like when I took classes, I needed to have my full attention in the class, so I took notes afterwards. But I also see the weakness in that, and so if I were to help students, I look at something, I say 10, 24, 7 is how I would recommend students take notes. And so I say 10. So within 10 minutes of something happening, write it down in some form. And so whether you do that on 3 pieces of paper, the first piece of paper being the 10-minute paper, is like, so that's like while I'm in class, take those notes, right? And sometimes students would have 3 sections on their paper, however you want to do it. The second part is 24, and what I mean by that is 24 hours later. So if you have English today, you did your 10-minute note taking, what you could do in class. The next day, you revisit those notes. And so you go back and read your notes, and what I do is I ask myself some questions about my notes, and they can be like, why did I write this? Or could you please tell me more about Othello and whatever, his relationship with this person, whatever it might be for English class going on. And that's the next day. And then 7 days later, I go back and I answer those questions that I posed 1 day later. And so how I keep track of this in my notes is I always put on the top of my piece of paper that I'm writing 3 check boxes. And so the day that I take the notes, I tick that box, like, okay, I took the notes. The next day I go over it, I tick the second box to know that I revisited my notes. And then 7 days later, I tick that box as like, okay, I went back and answered these questions. And so I'm just constantly going through my notebooks, that all my notes, they're dated the day I took the notes. And then that way I'm revisiting at a minimum my notes 3 times. And long term, this helps me to not have to cram. Like I would never, and I still don't, even when I did in university, I don't cram for a test. Like if I have a test on Thursday, I don't change my routine to do something different on Wednesday. I know that I've revisited my notes. I know that I've done the readings, and that historically for me has been good enough. And I've seen lots of students that start to follow this routine. They start to recognize like cramming isn't a thing, because I spent like equal time more or less on stuff that needed to be studied over time.
Yeah, I think that's a very good suggestion and technique and skill that students can use. It sounds like it actually works and it makes you revise more, which is a skill I think we all kind of need.
Yeah.
So, just a very simple and quick question to follow. So, what would you describe as an effective learner? Like someone that does good or in school, or someone that actually learns but
Yeah. I don't know if that's a quick question. That's I think there are people who do well in school because they recognize the structure of school, and they recognize what teachers or the MYP or the DP are asking of them, and they can replicate it. Sometimes I wonder if that actually is a lot of learning, or is it more like regurgitating what you're doing. And so I do think those are 2 separate things. So I think as a community, sometimes we think those that are learning the most are those that have the highest grades. I don't find that to be true. If I were to narrow it down to one thing, I would think the most successful learners are those that can recognize where they've failed or where they're challenged, and find ways to meet that challenge or revisit that failure and do better.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that those are like so meaningful words, and they speak volumes. It's important to recognize that school is about developing and not simply at 1 grade.
Yeah.
Would you have time for another question, or?
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. When it comes to time management, what are like 3 things that you would suggest being.
And so I'll speak in the term of like us not doing home learning. And so for time management for me, has a lot to do with spaces. And so to elaborate on that, it is important to me, again, being a teacher and a parent, it's important to me when I'm home to spend time with my wife and my sons. And so I don't let work come into that space, because then it just like starts to blend work all over. And then I actually become less productive at work and less productive at home. And so what I tend to do is I have work spaces. Even during the pandemic, I had a workspace, and like that's where I go accomplish work. And I literally schedule time to be in those spaces. And so as a student, like school is for socializing as much as it is for education. But like while you're in this building, you do academics when you're in the classroom. I would encourage students to do, during their breaks and lunches, to take those breaks and lunches and enjoy that time. As you get up into DP, it's not so much for MYP. You'll have some flex times, or whatever you want to call them. And so I remember in university, I'd go to college at my first class, and I'd stay the entire day until my last class. And anytime I didn't have class, I was doing, aside from lunch and a few breaks, I did academic work, and then that day ended, right? And I put it away and I let it sit. And so I found it important for me for time management is that I'm more productive when I set away those times and spaces. Did that get at your question?
Yeah. Totally.
Yeah, that is a very interesting way of doing it. I think especially now when we are online, just separating your school time and the time you spent at your laptop with the time you spend with family, or just relaxing, is very important. And yeah, I think those are all our questions.
All right.
So thank you so much for your time.
Sure.
Okay, so now we just wanted to go over a few of the things that we learned, just so we can reiterate them. First of all, what I think is one of the greatest things that we learned was the 10-24/7 note-taking skill. I think that is something we can all use. It's very simple, or at least it appears so, and yet it forces you to revise ahead of time, which we all know is helpful, even though not all of us do it all the time. Saying that from experience. And Christina, what do you think was one of the best things you learned?
Yeah, to add on to that, I think Mr. Kehl also really reinforced the idea of having a separate workspace from a space that you share with your family and friends. And you should, even though you try to live a balanced life, you should try to have separate spaces so they don't merge and you don't feel like you're being less productive in both environments. So I think that's really important as well.
Yep. I think that's it for this week. We'll see you next week with a new topic. And yeah, have a good day, peeps.
Bye.